He bought a stranger's last ticket home, and by morning he was snowed in with her entire family, standing in the middle of a secret that could cost them everything. Nobody at that station could have guessed how far one small act of kindness would travel before the season was over, or how much it would end up costing the man who offered it. Before we get into tonight's story, if you're new here, welcome to Winter Vale. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and stay until the very end, because this one takes a turn that nobody, including me, saw coming when I first wrote it down. Winter has always felt like the one season that forces people to slow down long enough to actually see each other, and that's the feeling I wanted to chase tonight. I hope this story finds you warm, wherever you're watching from. Denver's Larimer Station smelled like wet wool and coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, the first real storm of December was rolling down from the mountains, and the departure board flickered with a single red warning. Final call, Silver Pine Local, Platform 4, 641. A voice crackled overhead, repeating the same words twice, and the crowd near the ticket counter thickened into something close to panic. Two people reached the counter from opposite directions at almost the same second, and neither one noticed the other until their bags collided. "Sorry, that was completely my fault," the woman said, stepping back with an apologetic laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. The man across from her only shook his head and said it was his fault too, and for a moment they both just stood there, catching their breath. They turned to the clerk together and asked for the same thing, one ticket to Silver Pine, and the clerk winced before he even finished checking his screen. There was exactly one seat left on the last train before the pass closed for the storm, and two people standing in front of him needing it. The woman was the first to step back. Her name was Josie Marlowe, 28 years old, a regional brand manager whose calendar hadn't had an empty square in over a year, and she'd promised her family she would be different this time. "It's fine," she told the stranger. "You take it, I'll figure something out." He hesitated, studying her for a second longer than he needed to. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked outdoors for a living, with dark hair damp from the weather and eyes the color of the sky just before it snows. "Are you sure?" he asked, and she nodded before she could change her mind. She walked a few steps away and pulled out her phone, and the man, without meaning to, heard every word of the call that followed. "Mom," she said quietly, "I know. I promised Grandma Opal I'd be there for her birthday. I tried. The pass is already backing up. I might not make it in time." She hung up before her mother could answer, because she didn't trust her own voice to hold steady for one more second. When she turned back around, the stranger was already walking toward the ticket counter again, and this time he wasn't buying anything. He was giving something away. "I'd like to transfer this to her," he told the clerk, nodding toward Josie, and the clerk blinked twice before printing a new slip with her name on it. Josie stared at the ticket in his hand like it might vanish if she looked away, and she asked him, quietly, what he thought he was doing. "Your grandmother's birthday sounds a lot harder to reschedule than whatever I've got waiting for me," he said, and something about the plainness of it made her laugh for the first time all day. "I'm Josie," she told him, taking the ticket with fingers that weren't quite steady. "Wyatt," he answered, and shook her hand like it was the easiest thing in the world. The doors began closing before she could say anything else, and she barely managed to wave before the platform swallowed her into the crowd boarding the train. Wyatt Harmon stood there a moment longer, watching the train ease out into snow that was already coming down harder than the forecast had promised, and then he turned toward the exit to find a hotel for the night. Josie Marlowe had spent 6 years climbing the ladder at a national hotel brand, and every promotion had quietly cost her something at home. Another holiday worked through, another birthday attended by video call instead of in person. She loved her family fiercely, but every visit back to Silver Pine carried a small, familiar ache of guilt she could never quite outrun, and this year she had sworn to herself it would finally be different. Wyatt Harmon was 33 and had spent the last 6 winters running the mountain rescue crew above Silver Pine, the kind of man who solved other people's emergencies without ever expecting to be thanked for it. He had once taught introductory geology at a small college 2 states away, before his brother's death sent him back to the mountains for good, trading a classroom for a radio and a rope. A station attendant caught him before he reached the doors. There was, apparently, one more option, an overnight shuttle running north along the old highway for anyone who hadn't gotten a seat, slower and rougher than the train, but scheduled to reach Silver Pine by morning if the roads held. Wyatt looked at the snow piling against the windows and decided it would have to do. The shuttle wasn't full, just a handful of tired travelers scattered through the seats, all of them wrapped in the particular exhaustion of people who wanted nothing more than to be home before the holidays truly began. Wyatt leaned his head against the cold glass and closed his eyes, with no idea that the storm outside was about to put him back in Josie Marlowe's path before sunrise. 40 minutes north of the city, the weather turned from bad to something worse. Snow came sideways across the tracks, thick enough to swallow the headlights of Josie's train, and the whole car lurched as the brakes fought for grip on ice nobody had accounted for. An announcement crackled through the speakers, apologizing for a full stop somewhere in the mountains. 20 long minutes later came the news nobody wanted, that a section of track ahead had been buried by a small slide and wouldn't be cleared until morning at the earliest. Passengers would need to disembark at the next stop, a maintenance platform barely large enough to be called a station, with no taxis, no shelter beyond a single wooden overhang, and snow falling in sheets. A few miles down the old highway, Wyatt's shuttle wasn't faring any better. A stretch of road near a switchback had already drifted shut, and the driver came over the intercom, sounding more tired than worried, announcing that the nearest safe place to wait out the storm was the same small rail platform the train passengers were already gathered at. Wyatt pulled his collar up against the wind and stepped down into snow that came past his ankles, not yet realizing that someone standing under that same narrow shelter had already noticed him. He ducked beneath the overhang, shook the snow from his shoulders, and only then looked up to see Josie staring back at him in open disbelief. Nearly an hour after that, headlights swept across the little parking lot as an old green pickup fought its way through the drifts. A woman jumped out before the truck had fully stopped and pulled Josie into a hug, so tight it nearly knocked them both into the snowbank. Behind her, a broad-shouldered man in a canvas coat climbed out more slowly, grinning the second he saw his daughter. "You made it," Gordon Marlowe said, and Josie hugged him hard enough to answer for her. As they loaded her bag into the truck bed, Josie glanced back toward the shelter and went still, because standing alone under that little wooden roof, snow dusting his shoulders, was the same man who had given up his seat for her hours earlier. Her mother followed her gaze and asked who that was, and Josie told her, still half in disbelief herself, that it was the stranger who had handed her his train ticket back in Denver. Renata Marlowe didn't hesitate for even a second. She marched straight through the snow toward Wyatt with an umbrella she didn't need anymore, Josie hurrying behind her, telling her mother it really wasn't necessary. "You're the young man who gave up his seat for my daughter," Renata said, and it wasn't really a question. Wyatt tried to explain that it hadn't been a big deal, and Renata cut him off before he finished the sentence, informing him that he was coming home with them, and that the matter was already settled as far as she was concerned. Gordon walked over next, snow catching in his gray beard, and put out a hand for Wyatt to shake. "You gave my girl a seat on the last train home," he said. "The least we can do is give you a bed." For the first time that night, Wyatt found himself completely outvoted, 3 against 1, with nowhere left to argue. Josie looked between her determined mother, her smiling father, and the quiet stranger who had somehow rearranged her entire evening with one small decision at a ticket counter, and she felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Whatever plans Wyatt Harmon had for that night, the Marlowe family had just made new ones for him instead. The drive to Silver Pine took almost 2 hours through drifting snow and switchback roads, and by the time the truck's headlights found the long gravel lane leading up to the Pinecone Inn, it was nearly midnight. Every window of the old lodge glowed gold against the dark, and even from a distance, Josie could hear laughter spilling out into the snow. Her grandmother, Opal Marlowe, was turning 80 that week, and half the family had refused to go to bed until Josie made it home, cake or no cake. The moment the truck doors opened, the whole living room seemed to erupt at once, aunts and cousins crowding the doorway, someone shouting that she'd finally made it, someone else asking who on earth was standing behind her. Renata didn't waste a second before pulling Wyatt forward by the sleeve and announcing to the entire room that this was the young man who had given up his seat on the train so Josie could get home in time. It took exactly that one sentence for the whole family to reach the same conclusion, and within moments Josie was fielding questions she had no idea how to answer. Opal herself shuffled in from the kitchen with a plate of gingerbread, studied Wyatt from his snow boots to his damp hair with the confidence of a woman who had outlived 4 husbands' worth of bad first impressions, and nodded once like she'd settled something important. "My future grandson," she said simply, and Josie nearly dropped the mug someone had just handed her. Across the room, Josie's 8-year-old niece Daisy wandered over with a cookie in each fist, looked from Wyatt to Josie and back again, and asked, with the devastating honesty only a child can manage, when the wedding was. Wyatt tried to explain that they'd only met that evening, and Daisy simply shrugged and said that wasn't what Grandma Opal had told her. By the time dinner was finally served, 3 separate relatives had already debated the merits of a spring wedding versus a fall one, entirely in front of 2 people who had known each other for less than 6 hours. Josie laughed harder that night than she had in months, and somewhere between the laughter and the noise, she caught herself forgetting to feel guilty about the job she'd left behind in the city. After dinner, Gordon disappeared into the barn behind the inn and came back struggling with an old wooden porch chair that had belonged to Josie's grandfather, one armrest hanging loose after years of winters. Without being asked, Wyatt rolled up his sleeves and knelt beside him, and the 2 men worked mostly in comfortable silence, tightening joints and sanding rough edges by lantern light. Josie watched from the kitchen doorway longer than she meant to. She had dated men before who announced every kindness before anyone could notice it themselves. Men who turned small good deeds into something to be thanked for. Wyatt never once looked up to see if anyone was watching, and something about that quiet, unbothered decency settled into her chest and stayed there. When the chair was finally steady again, Gordon eased himself into it and rocked once, twice, with no creak at all, and looked up at Wyatt with real admiration. "You've got good hands for this," he said. Wyatt only shrugged and said that most of his job was rescue work up on the mountain, and that a porch chair was about the easiest thing he'd fixed all season. Later, out on the back porch while the rest of the family searched the kitchen for leftover pie, Gordon and Wyatt stood together watching snow drift past the porch light. Through the window, Josie was drying dishes and laughing at something one of her cousins said, and Gordon watched her for a long moment before speaking. "She almost didn't make it tonight," he said quietly. "She hasn't made it home in 5 years running." Wyatt remembered the phone call at the station, the way her voice had cracked apologizing to her mother, and understood for the first time what those words had really meant. She hadn't been running from her family because she didn't care. She'd been running toward them, terrified she'd disappoint them again, and one stranger's ticket had given her exactly enough time to keep her word. Morning arrived pale and blinding, sunlight bouncing off snowdrifts that had buried half the driveway overnight, and the highway crews confirmed what everyone already suspected, that the roads out of Silver Pine wouldn't be cleared until at least the following afternoon. Wyatt wasn't going anywhere, and for reasons she didn't examine too closely, Josie found she didn't mind that at all. Gordon declared it a good enough excuse for breakfast on the porch despite the cold, and within an hour the whole family had turned the snowbound morning into something like a celebration. Blankets dragged outside, cocoa passed hand to hand, someone's radio playing old country songs through a cracked window. Even trapped by a storm, the Marlows seemed determined to make it feel like a gift rather than an inconvenience. Wyatt offered to help clear the walk with Gordon's snowblower, insisting cheerfully that after years working mountain rescue, a little snow removal would be no trouble at all. 20 minutes later, he was standing waist-deep in a drift after the old machine jammed and threw a spray of snow directly into his face, and Josie laughed so hard she had to grab the porch railing to stay upright. "So this is what mountain rescue looks like," she called out, and he wiped snow from his eyebrows and told her, with as much dignity as he could manage, that the machine had clearly been sabotaged. Daisy and 2 of her cousins immediately declared it a snowball war, and within minutes half the family was outside, laughing and shouting as snow flew in every direction across the yard. Once the snowball war finally ended in a tie nobody agreed on, Daisy dragged out an old wooden toboggan from the barn and declared that the hill behind the inn was open for business. Wyatt spent the next hour hauling delighted children back up the slope, and even Gordon took one wobbly run down the hill himself, landing in a drift to Renata's endless amusement and Opal's loud applause from the porch. Later, once everyone had come inside to thaw out by the fire, Opal disappeared for a moment and returned with a stack of old photo albums that made Josie groan out loud. Page after page revealed a much younger Josie missing her front teeth, wearing oversized snow boots, once buried up to her waist after a sledding accident that had made her cry for exactly 10 seconds before she demanded to go again. Wyatt watched from the couch, quietly delighted, as the polished brand manager who always seemed to know exactly what to say dissolved into someone looser and younger with every page her grandmother turned. He had never seen her laugh so freely, without a calendar or a client waiting on the other end of it, and something in him settled a little further into wanting to stay exactly where he was. By afternoon, the storm had cleared enough for real sunlight to spill across the valley, turning the snow-covered pines behind the inn into something that looked almost too perfect to be real. Josie found herself standing beside Wyatt at the edge of the tree line, both of them a little out of breath from the snowball fight, and for a moment neither one of them said anything at all. "Can I ask you something?" Josie finally said, watching her breath fog in the cold air. Wyatt nodded, and she asked him gently why he always seemed so careful, like he was bracing for something, like some part of him stayed guarded no matter how warm the room got. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My younger brother worked mountain rescue with me for 6 years," he finally said, watching the snow settle on the branches above them. "There was an avalanche warning we both knew about, and I told him to wait for backup. He didn't." Josie went very still beside him, and Wyatt kept his eyes on the trees rather than on her. "I found him 3 hours later. I was 10 minutes too slow." Josie reached over without quite deciding to and rested her hand over his, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things deserved silence more than sympathy. Eventually, she asked quietly if that was why he still worked the mountain, and he nodded and said that leaving felt like losing his brother twice. So instead, he stayed and made sure it never happened to anyone else on his watch. She understood, finally, that it had never been people Wyatt was afraid of getting close to. It had been the fear of losing someone else the way he'd lost his brother, of caring enough that it could break him again. Something in her chest ached for him, and something else, quieter and warmer, settled into place at the same time. That evening, after the family had gathered around the fireplace with cider and old photo albums that made Josie groan every time her grandmother pulled one open, Gordon called Josie into his small office off the kitchen, his face uncharacteristically serious. He closed the door before he spoke, and what he told her changed the shape of the entire week. A resort development company called Ashcroft Mountain Holdings had been quietly buying up land along the ridge above Silver Pine for the past year, and their representative, a sharp-suited man named Derek Ashcroft, had shown up twice already that month with an offer for the Pinecone Inn's 12 acres. Gordon had refused both times, and both times Derek had smiled and said he understood, in a tone that suggested he didn't understand at all. 3 days earlier, a county inspector had arrived unannounced and cited the inn for supposed structural violations in the old barn and the guest wing, violations Gordon swore hadn't existed a month before, threatening a closure order that would gut the inn's holiday bookings right in the middle of its busiest season. Gordon suspected, though he couldn't yet prove it, that Derek Ashcroft's company was behind the sudden inspection. Josie felt her stomach drop as her father explained that if the inn lost its license even temporarily, the bank loan they'd taken out 2 winters ago to repair the roof would come due faster than the business could recover, forcing a sale on exactly the terms Ashcroft Mountain Holdings wanted. "It was," Gordon said quietly, starting to feel less like bad luck and more like a plan. When Josie mentioned it to Wyatt later that night, careful to keep her voice low so the rest of the family wouldn't overhear, his expression changed in a way she hadn't seen yet, something harder settling behind his eyes. He told her that Derek Ashcroft's name wasn't unfamiliar to him, that mountain rescue crews had been called out twice in the past year to unpermitted construction sites tied to the same company, both times narrowly avoiding serious injuries. The following morning, while Gordon met with the county inspector to formally contest the violations, Wyatt asked Josie to come with him up to the ridge where Ashcroft's crews had been clearing land, saying there was something he wanted her to see with her own eyes before anyone accused her father of imagining things. The snow had stopped, and the sky above Silver Pine was the flat, hard blue that only comes after a real storm. They hiked up an old service trail behind the inn, snow crunching under their boots, until the trees opened onto a wide clearing scarred with fresh equipment tracks and stacks of surveying stakes marked with Ashcroft's company logo. Wyatt crouched beside one of the stakes and pointed out something Josie wouldn't have noticed on her own, a property line marker driven nearly 40 yards onto Marlowe land. "They're not just buying pressure," Wyatt said quietly, snapping a photo with his phone. "They're already surveying like they own it." Josie felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. And for the first time, she understood that this wasn't simply an aggressive business offer. It was something closer to theft dressed up in paperwork. That afternoon, back at the inn, Derek Ashcroft himself arrived unannounced, stepping out of a black SUV in a wool coat far too clean for the weather, flanked by a younger associate carrying a folder of documents. Gordon met him on the porch, arms crossed, and Josie watched from the doorway as Derek smiled, the kind of smile that never once reached his eyes. "I heard about the inspection," Derek said smoothly, as though he were offering condolences rather than confessing something. "Terrible timing, right before the holidays. I'd hate to see you lose the season entirely while you're fighting a citation you might not win." Gordon told him flatly that he had no intention of selling, and Derek only shrugged and said the offer would stand for exactly one more week. Wyatt stepped forward before Gordon could answer again, holding up his phone with the photograph of the survey stake driven well past the property line. "Funny," Wyatt said evenly, "because your crew already staked out land that isn't yours. Might be worth mentioning that to the county before they finish reviewing your paperwork." For the first time, Derek Ashcroft's smile faltered. "That stake is 30 yards inside our fence line," Gordon added, stepping down off the porch to stand beside Wyatt. "Funny how your survey crew missed a fence that's been standing since before you were born." Derek's associate shifted uncomfortably behind him, and Derek forced a thin smile, insisting once more that these things happened, that boundaries got blurred on rough terrain, that nobody was accusing anybody of anything. "Nobody has to accuse you of anything," Wyatt said evenly. "The photo does that on its own." Derek's jaw tightened, and for just a moment the smooth, rehearsed calm slipped enough to show something harder underneath it, before he forced it back into place and reminded Gordon, almost too casually, that inspections could always be reopened if a citation ever got, in his words, complicated to appeal. He recovered quickly after that, insisting it was simply a surveying error that would be corrected, but the confidence had gone out of his voice, and he left soon after with his associate trailing behind him, the SUV's tires spitting slush across the driveway. Gordon exhaled slowly once the car disappeared down the lane, and for a moment nobody on the porch said anything at all. That night, the family gathered again for Opal's actual birthday dinner. Candles lit, the whole table crowded with dishes Renata had been preparing for 2 days straight. For a few hours, the trouble with Ashcroft Mountain Holdings seemed to fade into the background, replaced by laughter, off-key singing, and Daisy insisting loudly that she wanted to make a wish for everyone at the table, not just her great-grandmother. Josie caught herself watching Wyatt across the table more than once. The easy way he answered Daisy's questions, the patience in his voice when Opal told the same story about Josie's grandfather for the third time that week. And she felt something settle into place that she hadn't let herself feel in years, not since long before her career had swallowed every holiday she used to love. 2 days later, just as the roads finally cleared enough for traffic to move again, the county called with news that shifted the ground under everyone's feet. The inspector who had cited the Pinecone Inn had been placed on leave pending an internal review, after another property owner farther down the valley came forward with an almost identical story involving inflated violations and a rushed closure notice, all tied to land Ashcroft Mountain Holdings had wanted. For a few hours it felt like the whole ordeal might simply dissolve. The citation reversed, the survey stakes quietly moved back where they belonged, and Josie let herself believe the worst of it was over. She should have known better, because trouble in Silver Pine, like the weather, rarely left without one last violent turn before it finally passed. That evening, Wyatt got the call every mountain rescue captain dreads, a report of 2 hikers stranded on the ridge exactly where Ashcroft's crews had been clearing unstable ground, caught by a small slide that had shifted loose rock and packed snow across their only trail down. Worse, the coordinates placed them dangerously close to the same unstable slope where Wyatt had lost his brother years earlier. Josie watched him go pale for just a second before the calm mountain rescue captain took over, pulling on his gear with hands that had gone steady out of pure discipline. She asked if she could come, and he told her no faster than she expected, his voice tight, before catching himself and adding quietly that he needed to know she was safe, while he brought two strangers down off a mountain that had already taken someone from him once. The rescue took nearly 4 hours, most of it in failing light, and back at the inn Josie sat by the window with her mother and grandmother, all three of them pretending to knit while they really just watched the driveway. When the radio finally crackled with confirmation that both hikers were safe and Wyatt's team was heading down, Josie realized she had been holding her breath for longer than she wanted to admit. He came back cold to the bone, one sleeve torn where loose rock had caught him, but upright and steady. And the moment he stepped through the door, Josie crossed the room without thinking and wrapped her arms around him before either of them said a word. For a long moment, neither one moved, snow still melting off his jacket onto the floor, and something in her chest finally admitted what she'd been avoiding all week. Later, once the house had gone quiet and everyone else had finally gone to bed, Josie found Wyatt out on the porch again, sitting in Gordon's newly repaired chair, staring out at the dark tree line where the rescue had happened. She sat down beside him without asking, and for a while neither of them spoke, the cold air settling comfortably between them instead of pushing them apart. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if it had gone the other way today," Wyatt finally admitted, his voice lower than she'd heard it before. "And for the first time in 6 years, it wasn't just my brother's face I was picturing when I thought about not making it back." Josie's breath caught, and she asked quietly what he meant, even though some part of her already knew. "I've spent 6 years telling myself I couldn't let anyone matter that much again," he said, finally turning to look at her. "And then a woman needed a train ticket, and somehow I ended up standing on this porch not sure I want to leave when the road's finally clear." Josie felt her throat tighten, and for a moment, she couldn't find any words at all. She admitted, quietly, that she'd spent years being terrified that if she ever slowed down long enough to want something like this, everything she'd built in the city would fall apart, and that some small selfish part of her had almost hoped the storm would keep her here a little longer than it should have. Wyatt reached over and took her hand, and this time neither of them let go. Before either of them could say anything else, the moment was interrupted by a set of headlights turning up the long gravel drive, far too late for any expected visitor, and both of them straightened as Derek Ashcroft's black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the porch. He stepped out alone this time, without the polished confidence from before, and something about the tightness in his jaw told Josie this visit was different. "I came to apologize," Derek said, though his voice carried none of the warmth the word usually implied, and he explained, almost reluctantly, that county investigators had traced the falsified inspection report directly back to a payment from his company, along with records showing the survey stakes had been deliberately moved to intimidate smaller landowners along the ridge into selling early. Gordon, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of the car, listened with his jaw tight, and Derek admitted that he was here first, before the county's official notice arrived, to offer a settlement that would keep the matter out of the local papers and cover any damages quietly. Wyatt stepped forward before Gordon could respond, reminding Derek that quiet settlements didn't undo what he'd tried to do to a family that had never done anything but refused to sell their own land. For a moment, Derek looked like he might argue, and then something in his posture simply gave out, and he admitted, almost too quietly to hear, that the company had pushed him harder than he'd wanted to push, that quotas and investors didn't leave much room for conscience once the pressure built high enough. It wasn't forgiveness Gordon offered him, only a flat statement that the county could sort out the rest, and Derek nodded and left without another word. 2 weeks later, the county fully cleared the Pinecone Inn of every citation, and news quietly spread through the valley that Ashcroft Mountain Holdings had quietly withdrawn its remaining land offers along the ridge entirely, its name suddenly too tangled in an ongoing investigation to make anyone comfortable doing business with them. For Gordon, it felt less like winning and more like simply being allowed to keep what had always been his. Wyatt stayed in Silver Pine through the rest of the holiday season, splitting his time between mountain rescue calls and the Pinecone Inn's porch, where Gordon had started jokingly reserving him a permanent seat by the fire. Josie extended her visit twice, then a third time, watching her carefully guarded calendar back in the city fill instead with reasons to stay just a little longer in the mountains. On the morning she was finally due to leave, snow falling soft and slow outside the inn's windows, Josie found herself hesitating by her packed bag, unable to quite make herself carry it to the truck. She told herself it was only nerves about the drive, though some part of her knew exactly what she was actually afraid of, that leaving now might mean losing the version of herself she'd found again over these 2 strange, snowbound weeks. She thought about the version of herself who had built an entire career out of never staying anywhere long enough to be disappointed by it, and she wondered whether wanting to stay now meant she was finally healing or simply trading one kind of fear for another. It would have been easier, in some ways, to leave without asking herself any of these questions at all. Wyatt found her there and didn't rush her, just stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching her the way he'd watched her that very first night at the station. "You don't have to decide anything today," he told her quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. The mountain isn't either." Something about the simplicity of it, no pressure, no ultimatum, was exactly what finally steadied her. She told him, carefully, that her company had been talking about opening a small regional office out of Denver for months, close enough to the mountains that a weekend drive wouldn't feel impossible anymore, and that maybe, for the first time in years, she wanted to build a life instead of just managing one. Wyatt's whole face changed when she said it, like something he hadn't let himself hope for had just been handed to him. By the time the snow finally stopped falling that afternoon, Josie had made 2 phone calls, one to her company about the regional transfer and one to her landlord back in the city about ending her lease early. Gordon, listening from the kitchen doorway, didn't say anything, but the look on his face told Josie everything she needed to know about how he felt. Opal made Wyatt sit beside her that afternoon, patting the seat with the same authority she used for everything else, and told him quietly that she'd buried 1 husband and outlived 2 more relationships in this family that everyone had sworn were perfect, and that she'd learned long ago the ones worth keeping were the ones who showed up in a storm without being asked twice. Wyatt didn't have much to say to that, so he simply took her hand, and she seemed satisfied enough with silence. That evening, with the whole family gathered again around the fire, Opal raised her mug of cider and announced, with the same unshakable confidence she'd had the very first night Wyatt walked through the door, that she'd known all along how this was going to turn out. Daisy, curled up beside her, asked once more, hopefully, if there was going to be a wedding after all, and this time nobody rushed to correct her. Josie looked across the room at Wyatt, snow still dusting the window behind him, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with guilt over missed birthdays or unfinished emails waiting back in the city. For the first time in longer than she could remember, home didn't feel like a place she was always running late to reach. It felt like exactly where she already was. Sam arrived the next morning with his truck chains still rattling from the drive, apologizing for missing the whole ordeal while he'd been snowed in 2 towns over, and within an hour Daisy had already dragged her father out to the hill to show off the sledding record she'd apparently set while he was gone. Wyatt watched the 2 of them from the porch, laughing, and realized how easily this family had simply made room for him without ever asking him to earn it. Outside, the storm that had once trapped 2 strangers together on a single narrow platform had finally passed, leaving the whole valley wrapped in fresh, undisturbed snow, quiet and bright under a clear winter sky. Somewhere down at the base of the mountain, another late train pulled slowly out of the station, and this time, nobody standing at that counter was in any hurry at all to catch it. Sometimes the smallest decision, 1 seat given away to a stranger at a ticket counter, turns out to be the exact moment an entire life quietly changes direction. Wyatt thought he was simply helping someone make it home for a birthday. Josie thought she was only trying to keep a promise to her grandmother. Neither of them could have known that a storm, a stubborn family, and 1 dishonest man on a mountain ridge would end up writing the rest of their story for them. If you had been the one standing at that counter with only 1 seat left on the last train home, would you have given it away to someone you'd never met before? And do you believe kindness like that always finds its way back to the person who gave it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found you tonight, please subscribe to Winter Veil so you don't miss the next one.